Hey, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Dive, where we talk about the narratives that shape our world. As your partners in narrative, I'm Angela Natividad, your resident mythologist.
And I'm Jessica Buchleitner, your resident journalist.
So today we're talking about virgin narratives. There are probably a lot of things that come to mind the moment that you hear this word virgin. I think of Virgin Mary, virgin mojitos now that I'm pregnant. Jessica brought up the topic earlier of like how people say that they're virgin when they start things for the first time. So there's very much this association. I mean, it's a term that feels very straightforward to us. We all, I think we get a sense that we understand what it is and that it's a monolithic idea. But there are actually a lot of different ideas that are bundled into this term, right? You have a purity, you have beginnings, there's an element of solitude that requires protection. So we're going to kind of pick through these and examine them a little bit more closely and kind of look at also how we use these ideas and where those ideas come from. So I wanted to start by saying that a virgin, like the concept of the virgin, actually comes from the Greek, possibly also the Latin. But the term for virgin in Greek is parthenos. And this is probably also a term that you recognize because we use the root of it, parthenos, in many things like parthenogenesis, which is like self-fertilizing, parthenogenesis, pardon me, which is self-fertilizing, and also the Parthenon, um, which was the great temple at the top of the hill in the middle of Athens, dedicated to Athena Parthenos. And this is one of the places that I wanted to go from a mythological perspective first, because our understanding of virgin is in part very, very influenced by the story of the Virgin Mary, which we'll get to in a minute. But the antique understanding of virgin was really, really different. It wasn't related to an idea of purity in the sense of a woman specifically not having sex. It was related to an idea of maidenhood. It's true. So you also have this element of youth that comes into the idea of virginity, but a specific kind of maidenhood, a maidenhood that's more related to sovereignty than untouched youth. So when you're talking about Athena Parthenos, you're evoking all of these ideas of Athena as a maiden, but don't forget that Athena is also a goddess of war and strategy. And that didn't necessarily mean that she was virginal. Like there was very much the sense of Athena as a sovereign entity. And that was how Parthenos was very typically used. So, for example, Inanna, the goddess of fertility in Sumer, Ishtar, also a fertility goddess, Aphrodite. These are not goddesses that you associate with sexual purity. They were also considered Parthenos, regardless of whether or not they were married, because they were understood to be sovereign in and of themselves. Like,
Wow.
yeah, they sort of did whatever they wanted and they had to be dealt with on their own terms. Like there was not a domestic situation that you had to deal with regard to them. Like it wasn't their husbands you had to take into account or their children that you had to take into account. You were dealing with them directly on their terms. So this is actually the original source of the term virgin, and this sort of trickles into early Christianity. Like the evolution of the Virgin Mary is very interesting because Christian mythology, like there's a lot of complexity related to how Christian mythology is developed, and it's developed by many people with many very, specific political ideas. But one of the ideas related to the development of Christian mythology was how important it was to relate it to a long lineage, because at the time that Christianity was developing, like some decades after the death of Jesus Christ, um, there was a big break between people who understood themselves as Christians and people who understood themselves to be Jews. The Jews were, for many reasons, very traumatized by this whole like Messiah issue. They were punished multiple times by the Romans for the whole like the Messiah situation. So they were like,
Monotheism. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So they were like, we're just going to focus on the Torah and we're throwing out all of this Messiah stuff. Like the Torah is going to be our jam. And Christianity distinguished itself from that heritage by saying, no, like the Messiah thing is very important. And we're going to make a case that not only, like, not only is this sort of like the future of religion, it also comes from a very long lineage. It's not something that was just born yesterday. So they tied it to a lot of existing messianic stories. So there are a lot of like existing Greek and also Egyptian stories about resurrecting gods. You have Ra, you have Horus, you have Osiris, for example, on the Egyptian side. But you also have a number of Greek gods that did this again and again. This is also something that you see in Celtic mythology. Like, when you're talking about the Wheel of the Year, this is the story of, the goddess who in the spring is courted by the god, and then she gets pregnant and he dies, and like he's reborn, and then he courts her again. So you have this resurrection of the god inside the Wheel of the Year as well. So to this we add the Virgin Mary. One of the issues that Christians had with getting adopted at scale, particularly in pagan societies, was there were a lot of people who just couldn't let go of goddess worship. Like it was a deeply integrated aspect of their lives. And so they incorporated the Virgin Mary more deeply into their lore. To begin with, like Mary is a kind of stand-in for a lot of existing virgin, quote, sovereign goddesses that were being worshipped in different localities at that time. That's part of the reason as well why she's like often wearing a blue veil. Blue is often commonly associated with a number of pagan goddesses. So it didn't necessarily mean that she didn't have sex. So that's like kind of like a non-mystic view of it. When you're talking about a Virgin Mary, you're talking about a sovereign entity. It has nothing to do with her sex life. It doesn't matter where the baby came from. A second way to look at it is that the story of the Virgin Mary being impregnated comes from this longer lineage of these divine births. So, for example, Isis self-fertilizes herself with the reassembled dead body of her husband that happens to be missing a penis. So she has to create that part out of magic, and with like like with part of like the essence of her father actually, and she resuscitates him long enough to impregnate herself with Horus. And and that's one of the stories that the myth of the Virgin Mary draws from. So interestingly, if you look at like one of the origin story of the Virgin Mary, like when Gabriel the angel comes to her and says, do you want to do this? Like, are you interested in doing this? Like, it's a really interesting story. There are a lot of social issues associated with her doing this. Like, it's not something that's just accepted for women to get pregnant outside of wedlock. And so, there are a lot of like really serious repercussions that she has to consider, revolutionary repercussions as well. Um, she's partly motivated by the fact that like her cousin Elizabeth has also been kind of like divinely impregnated in the sense that she's quite old and is not supposed to be pregnant that old, but she just sort of is. Like she's pregnant with John the Baptist, and Jesus and John the Baptist obviously like they had their own special adventures and relationship. Like they become very close cousins. But Mary has like a lot to consider in this moment. And when she agrees, it is said that she's impregnated by the Holy Spirit. And the Hebrew term that is used in this particular context for the Holy Spirit is ruach, which is a feminine term. And there are a lot of scholars, this is very contentious, but there are a lot of scholars that make the argument that because the terminology for the Holy Spirit in this particular context is feminine, that really ties her to the Isis lineage. She is Parthenos, she is self-fertilizing, and she's impregnated by what's functionally the divine feminine principle. So there's a lot of stuff to like just starting with this topic. There's a lot of stuff to unpick that we don't really that we kind of take for granted around the term virgin. That's sort of like, once you start digging into the past and the origins of virgin, and we'll talk about like what's happened with that since, it kind of undoes this whole like, these sort of tacit associations about purity and young, vulnerable maidenhood, and just sort of this idea of women as this flower, which is a very kind of Puritan idea. I don't
That's
know if Jess, you have something to add.
that's exactly what I'm gonna get into that piece, because it's also so important to realize how much deeper this mythology goes with the term virgin. I mean, I think we have, or I find that we have in our societies that came from Europe, like the United States, the European Union countries, most of them have been influenced by certain religions that have their own definition of what virgin means. That's usually tied to the Virgin Mary narrative. Christianity is highly tied to that narrative. I remember there was a film, and this is my favorite word in German, Zeitgeist. There was that Zeitgeist addendum, and that documentary series that came out. I think it was in 2009 or 2010. Don't quote me on the date. But in one of the episodes, they actually bring up throughout mythology all of these instances of a prophet or a truth teller who was born to a virgin. And so this goes back thousands of years, that we equate virginity with purity, that we equate something that is untapped or unstolen in many circumstances with virginity. And so it's funny it's come into a lot of contemporary fairy tales too. And one of the ones that highly sticks out, I'm sure if someone's watching this, they may already even be thinking this, but the fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood, which actually originated in the early 1800s in Berlin, in Germany. And many arguments or feminist arguments around this fairy tale are, you have this little girl walking through the woods wearing a red cape. And so one of the arguments is that the hood covering her hair symbolizes her inavailability to men, and is supposed to be mirroring a lot of religious head covers that women wear, like hijab, or in the Catholic religion for many years, women did wear a veil when they would go into, sanctuary places. And so it's supposed to symbolize that she's unavailable, she's protected, but that there's this bright red color in contrast to this drab forest that's supposed to be this sexual impurity color. And it's gone as far in this argument to say that the red symbolizes a menstrual period. Here's this girl who is a child who's now going into womanhood. She's going on a prophetic journey through a forest. And then you have a predator who enters the equation. So her entering the woods symbolizes this transformation and this element of danger, but I would say more of a transformation. She has to go through the uncertainty of this to come out on the other side. But she comes across this hungry wolf who's manipulating her, tricking her into telling him where her grandmother lives. So we get that whole thing of don't talk to strangers. But the idea behind this is that her purity is being threatened here. Her like virginity or virgin purity is being threatened. And this has been an argument across, many feminists have written about this. It was the subject of a New York Times op-ed, I think about 12 years ago. I want to say it was 12 years ago. Should probably look it up. but it was written by the founder of the op-ed project, actually, who wrote about this phenomenon with Little Red Riding Hood. Funny enough, there's actually an alcohol in Germany called Rotkäppchen, which is I don't know if it comes from that fairy tale, but it has the same title or similar title. But with fairy tales, we see this element of a young girl transforming into a woman somehow. And in the process of that, her purity, her virginity is being threatened. There's a colleague of mine who produces a podcast series called Down to Brown. I think she'd be quite surprised if she knew that I had read about this or seen this episode that she produced several years back. But it was talking about how in some Indian mythology and stories, there are many stories that echo the same theme of encouraging young women not to lose their purity or not to lose their virginity. And we see this a lot. And so this notion of purity with women has been somewhat weaponized. And of course, that could be a whole entire other episode. But going back to the fairy tale topic, we look at what is the role of when the girl becomes a woman. And what's also been brought up by culture critics is that witches in fairy tales are often old women. They are living alone in a forest. There's this image of this gray-haired, grandmotherly looking woman who's casting spells on people or is somehow the oracle or becomes the oracle and then turns somehow evil. And it's almost like a threat by saying, here's this anger and frustration of being a discarded member of society, of being no longer pure. And once you cross that threshold of losing your purity, you are then cast away alone, which does echo culture in many ways, because for centuries, women who were not virgins were considered tarnished. They couldn't marry, they could not please a husband, they were not considered wife material or a valid woman in the community if they had somehow lost that purity, or if it was known that they lost that purity. There was obviously, with royal families, there was a lot of hiding of this element here. Henry VIII, having babies with multiple women, including the sisters of women in some cases. But that also carries over into our contemporary language now, where we say, oh, I'm a total virgin when it comes to that. I don't think we actually realize what we are saying when we say that term, that we're actually referencing a woman losing her virginity with sex. We just say, oh, I'm a virgin, meaning I'm a rookie or I'm a beginner when it comes to something. But why do we cling to that term is my question. Not to go so granular on terms, but it is something worth calling out, that it's still very much part of the English vernacular, that we say, oh, that de-virginized me, now I'm experienced with it. And when you really consider the roots of what this term means, it has some not so great implications when you consider it.
There's so much in what you brought up. Like, I think the first thread that I wanted to pull was that so much of this idea, like what we've done to virginity and this association of the value of particularly women's purity in virginity, shows up a lot in patriarchies. And this is not like just to gratuitously knock on the fact that we're like in a patriarchy, but there are many ways that humans have lived. Patriarchies are among them. And this is a common characteristic of patriarchies, like just in particular because power and often property and often privilege passes through the males. There comes to be an anxiety about whether or not a male son is actually one's own, which is not an anxiety that exists in matriarchal societies, for example, which did and still do, in fact, exist. So like one of the most famous books of like sociology and anthropology is Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa, which
Yes.
yeah, like I loved this book, like, and I love how so many of us know it, and I don't even know like the context in which like we
How would
know
I
it.
have known this? I don't know. Yeah, but I'm
Yeah, like
definitely familiar with it.
who first told me about this? But yeah, like Coming of Age in Samoa, sort of like it describes sort of like, the function of Samoan tribes and how girls enter into adolescence and they can make their own kinds of choices about who they want to sleep with and who they want to get romantically involved with, and there's no judgment associated with that. Because when you're looking at, for example, matriarchal structures, you're looking at more community oriented structures. And this was also the case in pre-colonial Philippine culture, as well as, oh yeah, there's the Masuo in China, which is a matriarchal line that still exists. And the women decide who to marry. Like, so, they marry whomever they like. The men sort of like, they line up like beauty queens. And and yeah, and they have sex with these men, and it's not even necessarily these men that raise their children. Their children are raised in a larger community structure, often with like their brothers or other male relatives who play the role of father figures in the lives of those kids. So I think one of the things that I really like about the Mosuo, which still exists, is that they make a very strong case that in these kinds of structures, everybody is kind of taken care of, and there's not necessarily the sense of the zero sum that exists in the patriarchy. Like in the patriarchy, you have a lot of anxiety about like, who belongs to whom, and issues about blood purity that don't necessarily exist in a matriarchal communitarian context. That's not to say that these situations are perfect. It's just to say that there are lots of different ways that humans have existed and continued to exist. And we don't have to lock ourselves into this idea that this particular structure that we're in is human nature. I also really liked what you said about, like what we've done to the old woman, and how like, like
Yeah.
once you lose this purity, you get cast out. Like on the other side of this, interestingly enough, old women who are who receive very little recognition, credit, or value, I think, in our cultures. And that's another feature, one, of patriarchy, and two, of this like effect of the virginity story. They're not very valued. But in pre-colonial cultures, in the majority of pre-colonial cultures, from the Balkans to Asia Minor to Europe, old women were considered part of the core value of a community. Like they were considered a kind of wealth, like gold, because they contained the storytelling of the community, often because they've seen many cycles of life. They were able to perform the healing and also perform the death rites of a community. So when communities are broken down by settlers or colonialists that come from outside, one of the first things that they do is disenfranchise these old women or these people at the center of a culture. So, for example, in Philippine culture, the shaman figures were called babaylan, and they were quite typically old women. When the Spanish arrived, not only did they break these cultures down, they did something very interesting. They actually commissioned painters to depict the pagans and the shamans, like these female shamans, like giving up their idols and surrendering to Catholicism. But instead of depicting them as old women, they depicted them as young and nubile and virile and often half naked, which reintroduces this topic of purity, like with imperialism and with Catholicism is introduced this idea of purity as well in sort of like the imperial story of the Philippines. So you kind of like you have these shamans that were at the center of a community that are repositioned as these like sort of like nubile, sexy women that are probably like, you can guess the implications. They were probably quite loose. Like, of course, they were worshiping other gods. This is also a feature that shows up a lot in the New Testament. Actually, like Yahweh is the original sort of like, yeah,
Well,
the
I
name
know
of,
that, but maybe people listening don't.
yeah.
So yeah, sorry, I didn't mean
Yeah.
to.
Yahweh never claims to be the only God around, but he's always really upset about the Israelites sort of cheating on him, like with other gods, and just sort of like wandering off promiscuously to like sacrifice a son to Baal, like instead of to him. And he's very punitive about this. So like that's also kind of like a holdover from that. But this is also something that you see in Greece, for example. The Oracle of Delphi was a real figure. It was a real job. It was quite a serious job. And it was only a job that you could get once you were a woman of over 56 years of age. And how is
Wow.
she? Yeah,
Major contrast to the more Judeo-Christian fairy tale narratives of purity, because the 56-year-old woman would have been a witch living alone in the woods,
exactly.
casting spells in
Exactly.
her loneliness and pathetic nature. Yeah.
Yeah. So you had this like this woman who's already lived multiple cycles of life. She's probably already had her children. She's already worked. She's been through menopause. Like that's where you needed to be in order to become the Oracle of Delphi in the first place. And then how is she depicted in pop culture, like 300, for example? She's young and nubile and constantly getting raped. So you have again this sort of like this revisiting, this like remanifestation of the idea of purity and the importance of purity, and also like there's something sort of twisted and creepy about it as well. Like you're dealing with a pagan culture here, and this is the kind of stuff that happens in a pagan culture. And because like the thing about purity is that you have to have a contrast to it, right? And this is perhaps especially apt right now because this happens a lot in war narratives. One of the best ways to position one country or one interest as the negative interest that you should not endorse is to talk about the women they're raping, like how
Mm-hmm.
they're kidnapping and raping the women. This is also something that happened like during the Civil War and also like during the lynching of African American men. There was a big anxiety like about that was like encouraged in storytelling about like what they were doing with white women. This happened with like every wave of enforced immigration. When Filipinos were brought to the US for the first time to work plantations, it was illegal for them to touch or fraternize with white women, but it was also illegal for them to bring their families. So, you know, you have these impossible situations that people are placed into, and you see this quite often in war contexts, like the group that's not appropriate to root for or to sympathize with. You get a lot of imagery and a lot of storytelling about how they're hurting and raping women, and all of this is related to not only purity and the value and idea of purity with regard to women, um, but a lot of other ideas too. The notion of women as our sort of cultural property is part of that, like that we have to protect in this context. Like there's an element of nobility that makes this sort of romantic. Um, and there's also this matter of, I don't know, this rather creepy matter of, you know, you could have like intergenerational mixing, which is not desirable. Like that's the best way to make something impure. But like the I think the most interesting thing about these narratives, like the way that we use virgin or purity in these contexts, is you kind of defang the idea of what a virgin was in the first place, which was like,
Exactly.
yeah, she's untouchable unless she decides. She is sovereign and she's strong. Like the Parthenon exists as a tribute to Athena, because it was intended as well to protect the city of Athens. Like it was a military fortress. Nobody was thinking about raping Athena
No,
ever.
definitely not. And the temple format that it is, it's
Yeah.
one of the things that I thought about was Warren Jeffs, the one, and I brought him up in another cult
Mhm.
episode that we did, where it's a Netflix documentary. It's called Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. And what law enforcement eventually uncovered, unfortunately, is a altar that underage girls were taken to. And I mean, girls as young as 13, 14 years old were taken, and there was a ceremony done around them losing their virginity to him.
Ugh.
So the virginity topic has been weaponized in a patriarchal form for
And also
thousands of
in the
years.
interest of
Yeah,
imperialism and colonialism.
exactly. And it's virginity is a currency in many ways of how many virgins do you have? Will you give me her if she's a virgin? And that's why it's such a virginity is kind of a cautionary tale, actually, in its own way. But I feel like I think it became that way more so once we started having the Christian Inquisition and the Middle Ages in Europe. This period shifted that narrative from what you're talking about with mythology that goes more thousands and thousands of years back. And our more contemporary view, which is still changing nonetheless, is very built on Judeo-Christian beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
At least in our Western societies, it is,
Yeah.
from what I can see. And so the value of a woman for the longest time, up until probably the last 50 years, was, is she a virgin? Is she pure?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's how you would determine her value. It didn't matter how good at math is she, how talented is she, how many languages does she speak. Nobody really cared. It was just more of the virginity was a currency that was bought and sold. There was whole economies around women's virginity.
This is also something that comes up a lot in trans conversation. When Bruce Jenner becomes Caitlyn Jenner, the conversation around Caitlyn Jenner is notably quite different from when he was Bruce Jenner. When Caitlyn Jenner was Bruce Jenner was an Olympic gold medalist and an athlete. This was how Bruce Jenner was talked about. And shortly after her transition into Caitlyn Jenner, there were a lot of like very compelling articles about how we don't talk about those things anymore. We talk about what she looks like, what she's wearing. Like there's this sort of brutal transition that also occurs for Caitlyn Jenner into being a woman and being seen in this very, very narrow view. And that's also quite interesting. And I don't know, like to bring things back like to the topic of Little Red Riding Hood, there were a lot of fairy tales like this that were initially intended to be like menstrual stories, in fact. And it's really hard to know how they initially ended or what they were initially intended to be because they were orally told to older women by older women to younger ones in order to walk them through sort of like the mysteries of what was going to happen with their bodies. And then they get written down by men, and then they look more like chivalry stories or stories about
Yes,
girls being saved.
that's
And
exactly it. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't want to put like too much of like the weight of where we are now on sort of like Judeo-Christianity, because also one thing that people don't understand about the classical Greeks is that they were also a patriarchy. Like there was like a Greek culture before the Greek, like the classical Greek culture that we know, that was a lot more matriarchal and also a lot more diverse in terms of how we lived. So, for example, Minoan Crete was run by a college of priestesses, is the common like archaeological consensus now. But the antique Greece that we know was sort of like culturally taken over by this northern tribe that came with their thunder god, who in fact like resembles Yahweh a lot. So that's where Zeus comes from. He was not originally from that region, and he comes with all of his other bro gods and a lot of the existing female gods, like the goddesses, and also like some of the other, like, you know, the murkier gods, like for example Hermes was already there. A lot of these gods are sort of like gently tweaked by this colonialism into how they would behave if they existed in a patriarchy. So like Hera, who was the goddess of unions and meetings, she just becomes the shrewish wife. And like, and Aphrodite, who is the goddess of obviously love and also sexual fertility, all these things. She has a very long lineage going all the way back to Inanna. She just becomes, you know, like she's very unfaithful to her husband. She's cheating all the time. There are sort of like jokes about her even among the other gods, like the famous story of like her getting caught in bed with Ares. Like, and everybody's just like surrounding them, making these like awful jokes. Um, So so it does merit mention that another place that we inherit these ideas from is ancient Greece. And ancient Greece had already been transformed by patriarchy. Athena is a very good example. Athena, at one time, like in a pre colonial time, stood for like the strength and support of women, their capacity to heal and harm, which is something that you quite commonly see in these menstrual stories. Like there's an ambivalent figure like a wolf or a witch who's designed to initiate you, and you don't know actually if they're going to kill you or if they're going to help you. That's like a really important transitional trope in these stories. So Athena had this much more nuanced sort of position in ancient mythology, and what she becomes in the Greek mythology that we inherit is a is this very classic female apologist for the patriarchy. She doesn't give a shit about women. Like she often punishes women more harshly, and she's mostly interested in heroes. And yeah, like with that, and with like this notion of like her as Parthenos and her as sovereign, you probably also start to get like over time this idea of Athena as virgin, like literally sexually virgin and untouchable, that shifts progressively, like with the interests of politics and colonialism and just like things that change, that shifts progressively into an enforced purity. And then it's not a self-enforced purity anymore. It's a purity that has to be enforced onto girls. And that kind of brings us where we are today. Yay.
100%. And one of the last points I would make is the patriarchal aspect around virginity stems from two things: ownership and sexual pleasure. And let me go into why. There's of course much talk, whether it's out in the open or not. Many times over, virgin women were preferred because they had not been expanded yet through having sex many times over with either multiple men or with the same man, nonetheless. So there's that piece, and then there's the control piece. Part of masculinity is domination. That's a big tenet of masculinity. Dominate, win the war, dominate, own, basically. And there's a widely held belief that when a man de-virginizes a woman in this capacity, he takes ownership of her at that point. And so there's a sense of pride mixed in with this strong masculinity ideologies around, let me dominate this woman to take ownership of her. But on top of taking ownership of her, there's an enhanced sexual pleasure. With this notion of virginity, we have several sub-themes, one of which is purity, which brings you to enlightenment when you are pure. It delivers you into a higher and better place. There's also a notion of dominance and ownership with virginity narratives that goes with masculinity, that overlaps with masculinity. But there's also a sense of power there with the mythology that you're talking about, Angela, which is exciting to me because most of the narratives about virginity that I've been told my entire life were quite disempowering for me as a woman. I mean, just incredibly disempowering because there's always the sense of once you've broken that barrier, there's no going back, you're tarnished. And a lot of that came from my Catholic upbringing in a sense. Not that I'm trying to offend any Catholics out there who are current believers, but that is one thing that I took away from the denomination.
Well, Parthenos was never related to youth specifically or sexual purity, right? Like it was sovereignty. It was really your sovereignty as a woman, as an entity. So yeah, I do think that there is something very empowering in that we've lost.
So that brings us to contemporary television, for example, television movies, popular culture. I found this academic paper from 2010 called Virginity Loss Narratives in Teen Drama Television Programs. And you and I are the child of the 90s when there were many teen drama television programs going on, Blossom, My So-Called Life.
Buffy, big
Buffy,
yeah.
Charmed. There was a lot of witchy stuff going on as well. And so Mara Kelly from the Department of Sociology at the University of Connecticut, at least at the time of the publication of this paper, talks about several subtopics in this area that I found to be fascinating. And one of them, as she said, there's the abstinence script. So it places a high value on virginity and really emphasizes the consequences of the loss of virginity. So you see the female lead character being depicted as getting pregnant as a teenager and having to face the societal scrutiny over that, getting an STD, getting HIV, some sort of disease known to be transmitted. But it's almost like a deterrence approach to virginity. If you lose your virginity, then X bad thing will happen to you and you'll be cursed. So there was that piece. Then there's the urgency script is another one that she calls that really defines virginity as a stigma, and that the loss of virginity is a necessary thing to maintain their social status or affirm their gender identity in general. So that one I think is a subtopic that can go various ways. But the third one was the management script, which sounds kind of corporate when you think about it, right? But it basically suggests that teenage sexual behavior is really sort of inevitable, but it focuses on how do you manage all of the societal aspects, the ideologies around teenage sex, but also the emotional risks associated with girls losing their virginity. And how does it dehumanize them? Does it empower them? And there's many conflicting narratives there. And we've seen it played out in television shows over time. So I found those to be kind of interesting because they do seem to be present in those series. Of course, I couldn't tell you what is on Netflix nowadays, how that's being reflected, because I don't watch a whole lot of shows these days. I'm far too busy to watch Netflix all the time. Maybe some of you can tell us what virgin narratives you're observing on Netflix television shows. I would actually be very interested to hear that. If anyone has anything to offer, really, because I'm wondering if these themes that she's identifying in this academic paper are still present in contemporary shows. Of course, this came out in 2010, so we're, about 13 years into the future from these tropes that have been observed.
I feel like this is really interesting because the biggest virgin narrative from television that I remember growing up was Buffy. Like that was a very notable virgin narrative, right? Like where she finally has sex with Angel,
Yeah.
and he like that was such a big deal to me. And he's cursed. Like he has this like magical, terrible gypsy curse where like if he experiences true happiness ever, he becomes evil. And that's like a very direct sort of, it's a story about like the consequences of losing your virginity, right? Suddenly he becomes this horrible man who says terrible things to her, but he also like he wants to murder her family and friends. Like, and she has to
her purity's gone,
yeah, repeatedly throughout the series, she has to kill him over and over, and they kind of both have to forfeit their love in order to just exist in the same world. And like that's a very, very rough sort of like, virginity or sexual purity narrative, definitely. And like, I don't know, now like what I think about is, I don't know, I just finished watching Sex Education, and I feel like that take on sexuality and, like just everything around like teenagers having sex is very different from what I grew up with. Already, like the French take overall was very different. Like if you watch like
Yes.
French movies like LOL, for example, which came out, I think, in the early aughts, um, there is the sense that like losing your virginity is like a special thing, and ideally it's with somebody that you like, but there's not so much social stigma, particularly for the girl, as in the US. Like, like when I was growing up, like, you were really worried about like being a slut, for
You
example.
did. You really did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if
And
there's a rumor going around about you, it could destroy your
yeah,
whole reputation.
it's true.
I was going to say horror movies. So
Of course, the
one of the
last
biggest places,
girl. Yeah.
and when I was listening to this episode of, I'm going to put these in the link below. When
Mhm.
I was listening to this episode about that, my friend who's of Indian origin talks about that girls in India are told to prevent them from losing their virginity. I would say that at least our American version of that was horror movies. Horror
Yeah.
movies always depicted the woman who lost the virginity in the backseat of a car or in her bedroom or wherever. She was always the one to die. But
First to
then,
die.
first
Yeah.
to die. But then, Halloween, the classic Michael Myers movie, the girl who loses her virginity is stabbed. Like she was. In fact, I think he even comes into the bedroom while they're having sex or when they finish having sex, or they're doing something sexual, and the message then becomes, "This is going to kill you." It's quite an extreme
Yeah.
underlying narrative when you consider it. And so the movie Scream broke that tradition in that Sydney, the main character, loses her virginity to her boyfriend, who is one of the killers, the original killers in Scream, yet somehow triumphs over the situation and survives. And so that one sort of starts turning around this virgin narrative within horror movies. But that is, that is always again, you're not pure, so you're cursed. It's an if-then fallacy when it comes to
Interesting. So actually, Scream is Little Red Riding Hood.
contemporary. Yes, you could say
Yeah.
that. Thank you for joining us for another awesome episode of Narrative Dive, where we take a deep dive into the stories that dominate our world. We enjoyed the discussion on virgin narratives, and we hope that this will open your eyes to see these narratives being played out in the art that you were looking at, the literature that you were reading, the movies that you're consuming, and just your overall notion of what the concept of virginity actually means.
So we'll see you next time. And if you like this episode, make sure to share it, like, and subscribe it.